Okay, I'm acting on a request that came from a viewer, and I'd like to thank that viewer for the request. And the viewer received an email about a place called Fort Nonsense. It's located in Morristown, New Jersey. And the photo in front of you is just put out today, October 25th, 2021. And it's entitled Morristown's Fort Nonsense Gets a Nonsense Facelift. So we're going to join in on one of the speakers. It's going to talk a little bit about the origin of the name of Fort Nonsense. So let's join this speaker as he tells us about Fort Nonsense.
We often think about the folklore and myths around where that name originated from. As early as 1795, it was known as Fort Nonsense. It's steeped in folklore and myth. As early as 1848, author and traveler Benson Lossing wrote in his pictorial field book of the Revolution the following. Its name was derived from the fact that all the labor bestowed upon it was intended merely to counteract the demoralizing effect of idleness. Washington foresaw the evil tendency of idleness and discreetly ordered the construction of a fort upon a hill overlooking the town. There was no intention to complete it, and when the winter encampment broke up in the spring, the work was, of course, abandoned. The lore of the origin of the name Fort Nonsense continued into the next decade when in 1859 in Harper's Weekly, Dr. Tuttle noted, Washington, finding his troops needed exercise, both for purpose of healthy and military subordination, set them to work at this fortification, as if it were a matter of the utmost importance in defending the stores, the people, and the army itself. Having answered its design, tradition says that Washington asked one of his friends what the useless fort should be named. The reply was, let it be called Fort Nonsense. There is some truth to his response. It was a matter of utmost importance to be placed here, overlooking the town. Notice the town green. It's an intersection of four main roads. These are colonial roads. They lead to West Point, New York, Philadelphia. They're a communications link. And given that they all come here to the cockpit of the Revolution in New Jersey and in Morris County, this fortification was also important to protect the warehouse and the storehouses in Morristown, even when the majority of the army was not here.
Okay, enough of that nonsense. So the rationale for calling it Fort Nonsense is because the soldiers were idle and needed something to do. Well, basically speaking, that's the whole entire summation of war itself. They're just out playing games. Now, many of the soldiers don't know that, and this is not to dispute the fact there was an army, or even dispute the fact that a fort was built. But it was built out of nonsense, because there was no Revolutionary War. There were no farmers grabbing their pitchforks and saying, let's go fight the British. The entire concept of a bunch of farmers fighting the most highly trained military forces in the world is total nonsense. And incidentally, the image of King George III was used for the fictional character called George Washington. So let's go to some other locations here, and please be patient with me as I click on my items. Okay, now there's another, here's some more from Fort Nonsense in New Jersey, Morristown, New Jersey. We'll play a little bit of that. Okay, so that gives you a little general idea of what it looks like up there. Now there are other fort nonsenses, and here's one in Annapolis, Maryland. So I've identified 3 locations that have used that title, Fort Nonsense. And the first one, of course, is Morristown, New Jersey. And then the second one is in Annapolis, Maryland. And the third one is in Matthews, Virginia. And incidentally, there's a Fort Nonsense Brewing Company, so... So back to the Morristown, New Jersey one. There's a diagram of it. Now, all 3 locations are appropriately named because all war is basically nonsense. However, it becomes internalized in the minds of people, and people truly believe that there's a lot of bombing and things like that occurring, when the reality is it's all just made up nonsense. Yes, some people get injured because of accidents and mistakes, and maybe even sometimes the injured or the deaths are because they're trying to simulate war. And in simulating war, there can be people injured, possibly even killed, because of the simulations. But are they actually out there fighting the redcoats, the English? No. It never happened. It never happened. But it happened in books. It happened in print. It happened in paintings that are handed down. And now it happens in oral tradition. People passing down the stories about the brave farmers taking their pitchforks and their rifle with a few musket balls and shooting the redcoats down and driving them off back to England. So King George had a decision to make. How would he rule this new land? He could station troops and rule by force. Or he could create a gigantic illusion that somehow the English were driven from America and America was permitted to exist on its own. Well, the whole idea of the American Revolution was, guess what? You guessed it. Nothing but nonsense. And who believes the nonsense? Almost the entire population. So I'm glad that some of you out there are not going to believe the nonsense. Fort Nonsense, appropriately named. And once again, I'd like to thank the viewer that sent me this suggestion about the nonsense of the American Revolutionary War. Thank you. This concludes the video.